Hi there, listener, and welcome to episode 252 of the Ski Podcast. This special episode is going to look at the rise and fall of Bladon Lines, a British chalet company who, in the mid-1980s, were the biggest ski company in the UK, but by the mid-90s had disappeared completely. Now, even if you've never heard of Bladon Lines, I think you'll find this episode fascinating. It's a story of two young men who met at university and were sure that they could do ski holidays better. It's about how their company rode the 80s boom and grew exponentially to become the name in British skiing. And then there's a fall. New, brash competitors came in. The market changed. And as one of our contributors put it, they were too big, yet too small at the same time. Now, this story has special resonance for me, as my first start in the ski industry was as a resort rep with Bladon Lines back in 1988. I was a fresh-faced graduate straight out of uni and was super excited to be joining such a high-profile company. And over the next few years, I had the chance to see Bladon Lines from the inside, as I worked 2 winter seasons, one in Châtel and one in Zermatt, on either side of a spell working in the sales team in their head office in Putney. So in 2022, when I was asked by the Ski Club of Great Britain to write an article about this very topic, the rise and fall of Bladon Lines, I jumped at the chance. I was limited to 1,400 words in that piece. And in the course of my research, talking to people who were out there at the time, I accumulated over 4 hours of interviews. And so I had to leave so much of the story out. So this podcast is a culmination of a project I started 3 years ago, and I've put a huge amount of work into it. The last glass of Parrot Claret, more of that later, was served over 30 years ago now, but Bladon Lines continues to hold a special place in the hearts of British skiers. So whether you like a bit of nostalgia, you're interested in the business of skiing, or you just like a good story, I think you'll enjoy it. One caveat before we start. Not everybody who contributed to the story of Bladon Lines is still with us. Tragically, one of the co-founders of the company, Mark Lines, died in a car crash in 1990. I didn't know him. I would have loved to speak to him, but as you'll discover, I did speak with his co-founder Simon Bladon, as well as many of the key players from that era. So let's find out more about the rise and fall of Bladon Lines, the quintessential ski chalet company. And let's start at the very beginning.
Every winter, we employ 200 girls aged between 20 and 25. The Bladon Lines Chalet Girls Cookbook.
Bladon Lines was founded by 2 friends, Simon Bladon and Mark Lines. When I started my research for the article, I managed to find Freddie Bladon, Simon's son, on Google. So I gave him a call to ask if by chance he might be able to put me in contact with his dad. Well, he told me, I don't have to give you his number because he's in the room next door. And with no warning and no preparation, which might explain the quality of the audio as this was recorded off my phone rather than in the studio, I was suddenly speaking with one of the founders of the company. Simon started off by telling me how he met his co-founder, Mark Lines, on his first day at Exeter University in 1971.
We were in a hall of residence called Bladon, and I went there with a friend of mine from Yorkshire, because I come from near Hull. We both went into what they call the junior common room. My friend who I went with, called Hugh Bethel, Hugh and I were wearing a tweed jacket and had sort of, short hair. We went into the junior common room, sat down. 80 other students came in, all with Afghan coats and hair down to their navels. We sort of thought, we need to start redesigning our wardrobe and growing our hair a bit. And late in walks Mark Lines. He's also got reasonably short hair and is wearing a tweed jacket. He looks around the room, spots Hugh and I, walks straight up to us, pushes us apart and sits between us. Something I've never forgotten. So I met him on the first day. He had been to Radley and had rowed for the Radley 8. I'd been to Eton. I hadn't quite rowed for the 8, but I was keen oarsman. So fairly soon we both joined the University Boat Club, and in due course he became the captain of the boat club and I became the secretary-treasurer of the boat club. And quite frankly, it was like running a little business together, because we got pretty little help from the university. So we had to sort of literally do sponsor this and sponsor that to go and raise the money to buy a new boat and everything. So it was just like running a little business together.
Simon and Mark stayed good friends, and a few years later the two were living in London together, both working in the city. They loved their ski holidays and often talked about how it could all be done better and how they could set up their own company.
We'd been on a lot of skiing holidays together with Super Travel or John Morgan, you'll have heard of. We kept having chats when we were on our John Morgan holiday and wherever it was. You know, why don't we do this? I'm sure we could do it better. They ought to give us a cooked breakfast. I'm sure we could do this better. We both had our job, so it was just chat, really.
But the crucial impetus came in July 1978, when Simon was sacked from his job at Schroeder's for developing houses in his spare time, considered by them to be moonlighting, so he rang Mark to let him know the news.
That got me the sack, so that day I rang up Mark, because we shared a car, drove into the city and drove back again. So I got back to my desk having been sacked, so I rang up Mark and said, Mark, I've just been sacked. He said, excellent, that's the best news I've heard. I'm handing my notice in this afternoon. I've got to go. I'm in a meeting. I've got to go. Or I'm about to go to a meeting. Got to go. But as soon as I finish this meeting, I'm going to have my notice in. End of conversation. This extraordinary telephone conversation, there was absolutely no discussion about why he was handing his notice in. He knew that I knew that we were going to start a ski company.
A month later, Simon was touring around the Alps looking for suitable chalets, with Mark's girlfriend accompanying him as a translator.
And we sort of travelled around Zermatt, Verbier, Maribel, Courchevel, just looking for chalets. We found 3 chalets in Verbier. We each got together 15 grand. So we had £30,000 between us to kick off. And I think that first year we lost 15,000 quid. We lost half of the money we put together. But, we did get people to go. I mean, we bullied some of our friends. So, we were 26, sort of quite young, really. And, of course, my father was livid. God, the lectures I got from him. You're a qualified solicitor. You're working for a merchant bank, all right, you got the sack. But, go off and start a ski business. You're absolutely bonkers. Well, he was right, of course.
The pair almost ran out of cash in that first year, but for winter 1979-80, they added chalets in Maribel and Courmayeur and turned a small profit, promising enough to continue. According to Simon, it was the company's third winter that the breakthrough happened, albeit by accident.
I got the job of preparing the prices. For year 3, I worked out how much, what the flights were going to cost, what the chalet rents were, what the food was going to cost, what the wage bill for the chalet girls was going to cost. So I prepared the prices. The only problem is, I'm not an accountant. I forgot to add in the overheads. Now this is actually fairly fundamental. I forgot to put in the overheads. Now the overheads were, we just rented an office in 309 Brompton Road, which is a little shop in Brompton Road. It was absolutely ideal because it was in sort of quite a smart location. The overheads, of course, one of the biggest overheads would have been the cost of the brochure and, the 2 or 3 or 4 staff we had in the office. I simply forgot to budget them in.
Ouch.
Anyway, the result of this was that our holidays were all 30 quid cheaper than anyone else's. As a result of that, we completely sold out.
This happy accident took the business to another level. Their holidays completely sold out, not just at peak weeks, but across the season, and the company made a profit of £80,000, equivalent to about £400,000 today. Bladon Lines had arrived in just 3 seasons. Let's hear from someone else who plays a big part in this story. Regular listeners will recognise the voice of John Yates Smith. I interviewed him in episode 231 about his career in the industry. He has just completed his 50th consecutive winter season in Val d'Isère, and he joined Bladon Lines in 1982.
In their first season, I think they had about 9 beds in Verbier. That was the first. Second season, they expanded. They had about 27, so they tripled in size. Next season, they had about 80. so they tripled in size again. Next season, they had 250 roughly, so they tripled in size again. Then the following season, they went to 500. I think that's when I joined. And it was the beginning of the end for Bladon Lines. Up until then, it had been really Murison Small, followed by Super Travel, and then John Morgan. And then along came Bladon Lines and did the job better than anybody and expanded rapidly, yes.
Take the sting out of complaints by using your charm, wit and personality. If this fails, then don't push them down a crevasse, as this will probably make the problem worse. The Bladon Lines Reps Manual.
We'll hear from John again later, but let's go back to Simon Bladon. Clearly he and Mark understood what customers wanted, but they also had an instinct for marketing. Take the famous Bladon Lines Parrot, for example. In the first 2 winters of operation, the staff had worn a plain blue uniform, but it was the introduction of the famous red, yellow and blue jackets that made Bladon Lines stand out, and not always for the right reasons.
The first year or two, we bought ski jackets for the chalet girls, and they were sort of blue, and we got a little sort of, over the breast pocket, we had a sort of, Bladon Lines logo thing. But then, probably second or third year, we thought, right, let's have a really bright ski jacket, so the red, blue and yellow. The first year, all the opposition, Super Traveller, Mark Warner, whoever, opposition, all started calling Bladon Lines chalet girls Parrot, because they looked like parrots, because of the colour of their ski jackets. So we thought, oh, wonderful. We now need to redesign the logo. The logo will be the parrot.
From then on, Bladon Lines were synonymous with the multicoloured bird, confusing many a skier as to the link between the tropics and the snow, but helping the staff stand out from the crowd of reps at the airport and in resort. I've mentioned already how Simon and Mark were great at coming up with ideas. That even extended to the dinner table. Pretty much every chalet company bought their house wine, of which you could drink as much as you want during dinner, in bulk. But it was Bladon Lines who were the first to label the chalet wine as their own. The red became Parrot Claret and the white Parrot Fin. Not everyone was happy about the parrot theme, though. Alistair Scott, ski correspondent from the Sunday Times in that era, described the jackets as hideously recognisable. John Yates Smith had his own view.
I think Mark was colourblind, and he thought those jackets were rather delicate shades of grey. I don't think he realised quite how hideous they were. I could never bring myself to wear those bloody jackets. I hated them.
Amin Momen went on to found Momentum Ski, a corporate ski specialist, but in the 1980s, he also worked for Bladon Lines.
I liked our uniform, and it was actually it was a good jacket to wear. We were all very proud of our jackets, and we thought we were kind of part of a very cool elite group. I had a one-piece ski suit, which was made by a sailing company, which was a great windproof, waterproof jacket suit, but it was freezing. It was impossible to ski in because it was cold. So I had to wear a jacket on top. Yeah, but it was 10 times better than the spots that Ski West had to wear. Those blue jackets with the polka dots. So.
Ed Mannix, now owner of the Zermatt specialist, Matterhorn Chalets, was at Ski West at the time and remembers the dotted Ski West jackets.
He came up with this thing full of this sort of clown outfit. Actually, it was a work of art. I think it was designed by a girl called Carrie Norman, who used to do the sort of brochure design for Bladon Lines in those days. But I think she was the principal designer. And even though we all thought it was terrible at the time, if you look at the detail on them, the artwork is really very, very, very detailed and a real work of art.
If you listen closely there to my interview with Ed, you'll hear some goat bells in the background because this interview was recorded live while he was walking around Zermatt. He also recalls the Bladon Lines jackets and had his own theory about the invention of the Parrot colour scheme.
But that came about as an accident because of the jackets. They used to just be a sort of dull blue colour, but they had zip-off sleeves, and they were made by Splashdown. And Splashdown were principally sailing people, but they also tried to sort of get it a bit into skiing. And so the sort of older generation, Bladon Lines anoraks, just had sort of blue zip-off ski. I mean, they were very unremarkable. Apparently, one of the chalet girls' brothers, or something like that, had a similar jacket from Splashdown, but it had yellow sleeves. And what happened was, because there was an opportunity to actually take the sleeves off one jacket and stick them on another, the Parrot was born.
When Nick Morgan founded the chalet company Le Ski in 1982, there was no escaping Bladon Lines, but he told me that not everyone was a fan of the Parrot.
I mean, at the time, Ian, they were the establishment company. Bladon Lines were simply the establishment. The Parrots were everywhere. And there was another company, it was called Ski Bon Neige, Mike Carter. He hated Bladon Lines. His company T-shirt or sweatshirt was a Yeti with a piece of ice stabbing a parrot, which was on its back. That was his company sweatshirt. He absolutely loathed them. I have no idea why.
Only the English could have come up with the idea of sending the expensively educated flowers of the Shires out to the Alps for 6 months to act as skivvies. But there would be no chalet holidays if there were no girls prepared to work 6 days a week for a laughable wage in order to enjoy a season of free skiing. Discovery Magazine, 1988.
But what of the Parrots themselves? Who were the young Brits who wore the jackets and cooked the meals? In the early years, the chalet staff were exclusively female. A ski season in the 1980s was a rite of passage for 20-something Sloane Rangers. You can Google that one, kids. Middle-class girls from certain schools, occasionally equipped with a basic cordon bleu cookery course, and who were prepared to work for a pittance, sharing tiny bedrooms for the chance to live the life in a ski resort. I'm in Moment again.
But I do remember the training booklet saying we don't recommend barbers and wellies, you know.
Nick Morgan has similar memories.
They were run by people of a certain class who couldn't necessarily cook, but, you know, could interact with the guests. And usually there was a sort of a cupboard in the chalet where they would live. And they would get up just a little bit earlier than the rest of the guests and cook a sort of, you know, pretty mediocre breakfast and do a sort of afternoon tea and then throw together a sort of a chicken dinner.
John Yates Smith amused me when he compared the pre-season training to standards today.
It never tried to become professional. It was glorious amateurishness right the way through. I mean, we do a 3-week training course in Val d'Isère. Bladon Lines' training course was an afternoon in Wandsworth Town Hall. And it basically went, now come on girls, you've all been to Roedean or Benenden, and maybe Cheltenham Ladies College. You all know how to serve grouse, so have a jolly good holiday and don't get pregnant.
In resorts, where there are plenty of customers, it should be worth organising a cheap dinner on the chalet girls' night off. Make sure that the restaurant owner gives you a backhander, which should be split equally amongst the reps. The Bladon Lines Reps Manual.
There may not have been any chalet boys in those earlier years, but there were plenty of male reps and ski guides. Moment told me how he ended up working for Bladon Lines.
I don't want to say it was similar to now, but there was a little bit of a doom and gloom around. So suddenly all these friends of mine had come back and go, it was amazing. We had the best time. And so I then asked my friends who they'd worked for. And, you know, back then, the leading companies were Bladon Lines, Ski West, Super Travel, Ski Whiz. I think they were the main ones. There were quite a few specialists, smaller specialists, but Bladon Lines certainly was. I mean, and you just pick up a brochure, and the brochure was the best marketing material. You look at all the faces, the people, the clients, and you go, I want to work for that company because the brochure is really inspired. I really wanted to be a ski guide. So they offered me a job as a ski guide in Val Thorens. We just all got on a bus in Putney, and an overnight Ski West bus, actually. We went to Val d'Isère for the ski guides course. And it was phenomenal because I was on this bus with the most incredible group of people. They were just the nicest bunch who were just going all over the place. You know, Val d'Isère, Maribel, and all the classics, but also resorts I'd never heard of. I mean, Bladon Lines were absolutely everywhere. They had a lot of Austrian resorts, a lot of Swiss resorts, you know, Saas-Fee, Crans-Montana, all over the place. And of course, we were very jealous of all the ones getting the jobs in Val d'Isère, Maribel, because that's where most of the chalet girls were. Of course, on day 2, the Solés, the bottom part of the Solés was closed because there wasn't enough snow. So we were training above Solés, but there was plenty of snow on Solés. So when we finished our training, 4 of us thought, we should just ski down. We're not going to get the cable car down. So we skied down in our uniforms. Fiona and Mark Lyons, who was there, they all saw these parrots skiing down. And of course, as soon as we arrived, they're all waiting for us. We were given a very stern warning saying, you've had your fun. You will not do this again, or this is a sackable offence. Gosh, that was a bit of a shock to the system.
I found it interesting that Amin was in trouble for skiing in his uniform. It seems so alien today, but at that time, any half-decent skier could guide his guests around the ski area. My first season, I was a full-time ski guide, which, to be honest, was a bit much. I enjoyed skiing with guests, pointing out the peaks and the great runs, but the last thing you want to do on a powder day is to be stuck with punters, and for what it's worth, I hate that term and never used it while I was working seasons. Most people listening to this podcast will know that ski guiding by British tour operator staff has been banned for many years now. There was a period at the end of the 90s when guides were stopped and arrested on the slopes. So it was interesting for me to see that Bladon Lines were already aware of that friction. The Bladon Lines Reps Manual specifically prohibits guides from accepting payment for instruction or special favours, whatever that might mean, as the local ski schools are immensely jealous of their monopoly to teach and may seize any excuse to make it impossible for us to operate ski guides. Given what we know of the future, with all British tour operators banned from guiding, that was prescient indeed. It's probably worth a complete podcast in the future, but let's not get distracted and get back to today's story.
This cookbook contains recipes handed down from friends, mothers, grandmothers, other chalet girls, or recipes that are simply made up. The Bladon Lines Chalet Girls Cookbook.
The Bladon Lines Chalet Girls Cookbook. So popular and so widespread was the dominance of Bladon Lines that they even published their own cookbook, partly for their staff to use, but also because of demand from guests for the recipes. It's an idea I copied when I set up Natives, an online community for season workers in the early 2000s, and the Natives Chalet Cookbook, note the gender-neutral title, was a big seller for us. Some of Bladon Lines' recipes from my own well-thumbed copy might have made it into the Natives version, including traditional chalet favourites of the era such as banoffee pie and prawn cocktail. If you take a chalet holiday today, you can expect excellent food, ensuite facilities, ample hot water, and probably a sauna and hot tub, maybe even a swimming pool and a cinema. In the 80s, the chalets were not quite like this. Amin Moment again.
These were domestic houses that were not used by owners, and we took them over and put them through weekly commercial use. So the oven was just not up to it. The electrics were sometimes not up to it. And sometimes the chalet girls were not up to it. As much as you can go to your cooking school and have all the training, if you've never eaten out and been to restaurants and understand service, understand how to present food to make it look appetizing, sometimes what was being served was not really pleasing to the eye. But, I always remember our booking conditions was, it excused us for absolutely everything. If your chalet girl wakes up in the morning, she's got a bit of a hangover and breakfast is a bit late, it can happen. There was just lots of disclaimers, but funny ones. You're almost like house guests and it's a party. The oven can break down and there could be no hot water, which was my biggest problem was everyone arriving at the same time, hot water. And we had that, in so many buildings.
Simon Hoskins worked for Bladon Lines as a maintenance man before going on to co-found the ski travel agency Alpine Answers. He recalls the lack of ensuite facilities.
In my day, a typical chalet would have 5 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and that would be perfectly normal. Some of them would have maybe a basin in the bedroom, and that would be quite a big thing.
It wasn't just the chalets that were different back in the glory days of Bladon Lines. It's almost impossible now to imagine a world without instant access to information at our fingertips. But this was a time when we had no internet and no mobile phones. Now, I'm a Man United fan. Today, I can get live updates from any game via any number of apps, even if it's rarely good news. Back then, if you wanted to know the football scores on a Saturday afternoon, you'd have to ring home at great expense. Or, if you had access to a fax, and more of that exciting technology later, you could sign up for a results service. Otherwise, it was wait until Monday morning to buy a copy of L'Equipe and look up the results from 2 days ago. More problematic for Bladon Lines reps was managing the thousands of guests on holiday each week without any mobile phones, especially on a transfer day. John Yates Smith coordinated the whole of Bladon Lines operations on transfer days, often via a public phone box.
We used to organise everything the day before, and then I used to stick up notices in the phone box by the public loos in the car park in Annecy, and the reps used to read the notice and used to say, bus 1 left at 10:30, bus 2 please 10:50, bus 3 11:10, and the last bus would take the message down. And so we communicated by papers stuck to the windows in public phone boxes.
Anyone else remember public phone boxes? They were a lifeline at the time, and you needed cash to use them. Amin Moman recalls being banned from using the tourist office phone.
Because it was expensive, so I couldn't just pick up the phone in a tourist office and say, can I just quickly ring up head office because, I don't know, I've had a no-show, or I don't know, there's a complaint because there's no hot water in a chalet. If I needed to phone, it was a bag full of coins.
Gareth Crump was another employee of Bladon Lines who's still working in the ski industry. These days, he's sales and marketing director at VIP, but he also remembers the challenges of those early days.
You weren't allowed to use the phone that existed because it cost too much money. So you had to get your telex.
The telex. Before even my time. Amin Moman had a similar experience before the fax arrived.
Fax? I had to use a telex machine. And the telex machine, what you had to do is type your message electronically on a computer, which then printed out this tape, like a Morse code. And then you go to the secretary in this office, which was a bus company, and then they'll feed it through a machine, which then sends the telex to head office.
You remember I mentioned signing up for the football results service via fax. Yes, there was a time when the fax machine, again, younger listeners can Google this, was cutting-edge technology, although at first you could only use it at the tourist office.
And then the fax machine came, which was a revolution. It was like, wow. Yeah. The resource didn't know how to charge us because they weren't quite sure how much it costs to send the fax through a phone line. And they were charging us a fortune for every page.
Gareth had the same issue.
And then they brought in faxes. Faxes were newfangled things. They were a great step forward. They were brilliant. But they were only in the tourist office. You had to wander up to the tourist office in order to send a fax.
I said mobile phones didn't exist. Technically they did, but not as we think of them today. The only models available were car phones, and they were huge, and I mean huge. Ed Mannix was one of the few members of staff to have one fitted in his car.
I can remember getting my first mobile phone. I bought one in London. I remember it was when I was my car was parked in the Bladon Lines car park, and this fitter turned up and put my phone in and all that sort of thing. And it sort of folded away, and you could actually walk around with it. It was the size of a small briefcase.
You may have been told at your interview that Bladon Lines considers itself the most upmarket company in Britain. The Bladon Lines Reps Manual.
So we've heard about the rise of Bladon Lines from when the company was founded in 1978 to the ubiquity of the Parrots a decade later. But we know that by the mid-90s the company disappeared. So what went wrong? A key twist in the story came in the mid-80s when Simon Bladon sold his 50% share to family friend Christopher Needler.
I sold my 50% share of Bladon Lines to Christopher because Mark and I had a divergence of opinion. It was all done very friendly, but we had a difference of opinion about where we were going, and it was simply a question of how fast the company was going to grow.
John Yates Smith brings a different perspective to this.
Mark Lines wanted to run the biggest ski company in Britain. He wasn't actually interested in making much profit. He just wanted to be big.
But Britain and the ski industry was changing. Ed Mannix told me that Christopher Needler spent a lot of money keeping Bladon Lines afloat as the market changed.
Without his, let's say, enthusiasm, I don't think is the word actually, but his loyalty to Bladon Lines and the fact that he had some cash, he had a lot of cash. We used to joke that every year he'd go down the rankings in the Sunday Times, top 100 rich people sort of thing. But only it was thanks to him. I will always give him credit for basically keeping the thing going, because it was a difficult time. The market was changing. There were these big chalet operators that had come around. All these people like Super Travel and all the people who we grew up with were going bust or dying, because the day of the specialist upmarket chalet operator was sort of coming to an end. And then Crystal turned up and basically made chalet operating a mass market product.
Nick Morgan feels Bladon Lines lost their way as they grown too fast.
They overexpanded, and the problem they then had was that they had to start selling through high street travel agencies. And therefore, not only were they losing a large margin to the travel agencies, but they were also losing control of who came on their holidays. There was a disconnect between the sort of the specialist nature of the chalet operation and the type of person who was coming on it. And because they'd expanded, it was all about numbers.
Nick wasn't the only one to say that Bladon Lines had overstretched. Simon Hoskins.
It's hard to know what went wrong because the brand was so good and it had such a loyal following. I think they just overstretched themselves. The office expenses were too high. They employed too many people in their London offices. It was all a bit inefficient. And when the competition came along, they had to sort of squeeze their margins, and they just suddenly realised that they weren't making money, basically.
As Ed Mannix mentioned, the market had changed, with new competitors such as Crystal Ski joining the party in the late 80s and aggressively courting chalet owners.
Another thing they were doing, we were at the time, we sort of made a joke of it. I remember, that Crystal were going around with carrier bags full of money and literally waving them at people.
Gareth Crump was seeing the same thing.
It was a time of sort of hyperinflation when it came to rents, because they started off fairly reasonably because there wasn't a market. But through the sort of late 80s, there's a plethora of British companies that would pick up anything and pay. There was this sort of a ratchet effect on the rents, which is one of the problems with the business model. It got out of control. Rents were paid too high for the quality of this bed stock that was being offered in return.
Amin Moman told me how much contract negotiations had changed from when he first started.
Because I do remember, on a yearly basis, I'd go sit down with my chalet owners, have a glass of wine, and we just shake hands and renew. Suddenly, they said, Crystal had just turned up with, and they're offering me a lot more money. And I went, okay, how much more? A lot more. It in a way, started creating a bit of a false economy because they wanted to get these beds at any cost.
It wasn't just the competition that affected Bladon Lines. There were some major changes in personnel that may not have helped. In 1991, the company sacked Fiona Easdale as managing director. This is probably worth an episode in itself, but put simply, John Yates Smith and Easdale then joined forces to start their own chalet company, YSE, taking many of the best chalets in Val d'Isere with them. There are always two sides to every story, but this is how John Yates Smith saw it.
They brought in management consultants. The management consultants went around Bladon Lines and they said to someone, "What do you do?" He said, "Well, I stick stamps on envelopes." "Right, that's good. That's a useful job." "What do you do?" "I answer the phone and talk to people." "Oh, that's a useful job." And they said to Fiona, "What do you do?" She said, "Oh, a bit of this, bit of that." And they noted down that she didn't really have a proper job. You get rid of her. And she was the only reason Bladon Lines had run so well, and it single-handedly she really ran it. And when they got rid of her, I think Bladon Lines lasted about 2 years.
Fiona contacted John while he was spending the summer in Corsica.
Yes, she rang me in Corsica and said, "I've just been sacked." And I thought, my God, if they sack their best person, there's not much hope for the rest of us. So I better jump ship rapido. And so we agreed to set up a company and just do Val d'Isere.
Ed Mannix felt that the two of them could see the company was already in decline.
Oh, and I think they just realised that Bladon Lines wasn't what it was, and they reckoned they could run the thing better and themselves. And the proof of the pudding, they're still going.
Amin Moman followed the move with interest.
Yeah, Val d'Isere was very much, it's one of our biggest resorts, and that's where John had always been. He's a great friend, and I think, but they were both extremely smart. Fiona was my boss, and I was very sad to see her leave. I was, because I liked working for her, but I was also excited for them. They had an amazing niche. They've done an incredible job.
I should add at this point that if you want to hear more from John Yates Smith and his many, many entertaining anecdotes from this era, I recommend you listen to my interview with him in episode 231. I'll put a link in the show notes to that. The death knell for Bladon Lines came in 1995 when Ingham's bought the brand. It meant that Christopher Needler could stop subsidising the company and theoretically gave Ingham's a tool to compete more directly with Crystal.
He was a very happy man. I remember when he sold it, when the ink was not even dry, but I think he was just sort of relieved more than anything else that he managed to offload it on somebody, and the responsibility of funding it was no longer with him. Ingham's were obviously keen because they wanted to expand. They obviously saw what Crystal were up to. They saw that the British ski market was moving in that direction at the mass level as well. Previously, chalets had been very much the preserve of the upper middle classes, and it was the specialists. And all of a sudden it would become mass market.
Amin Moman had concerns from the start that the acquisition wasn't a good fit.
We were a boutique, and I think suddenly I felt like I was part of a supermarket. But I was interested to know how the big boys operated. And I stuck around for a year to see how all that worked. They didn't have the expertise. They just didn't have that mentality of what chalets are all about. They bought it because I think they reacted to Crystal.
Gareth Crump had similar concerns.
When that came to be taken over by Ingham's didn't understand how chalets work.
Simon Bladon told me that he offered to come back to help run the new Bladon Lines division of Ingham's, but was given the cold shoulder. The biggest mistake, he believes, that Ingham's made was to shut down the Bladon Lines brand completely.
They thought they knew how to do it.
Yeah.
They absolutely did not. And the biggest mistake they made is that they got rid of the name Bladon Lines and absorbed it into Ingham. You should never absorb an upmarket brand into a more downmarket brand.
It does seem kind of obvious in retrospect. Nick Morgan couldn't believe what Ingham's had done.
Then, unbelievably, after having bought the biggest name in skiing, they completely got rid of the logo from the next brochure, and it was an Ingham's brochure. And that's just all about a kind of arrogance, really. I mean, why would you do that?
Ed Mannix agrees.
Financially, it didn't make sense. Right? Well, they didn't see it as making sense, running it as two separate organisations, where they thought they knew better. The thing was that they were trying to preserve the sort of specialist nature of it. And, of course, they missed the point completely. And they sort of turned it into a sort of mass market thing. And that was it, really. And that was the beginning of the end.
Working in a ski resort provides lessons which are foundational and even unobtainable in a more ordinary management position. The Sunday Telegraph, 1995.
While Bladon Lines' fall was as rapid as its rise, the company's legacy lives on in the ski industry. As you may have worked out by now, everyone I interviewed in this podcast is still working in the industry 4 decades later, many of them having set up their own businesses. Part of that was because of the opportunities for promotion and high levels of responsibility reps took on. Gareth Crump thinks that you mature fast when you work ski seasons.
Oh, yeah. I think one of the things about travel industry is that you can get promoted quite quickly, and you can get huge responsibilities very early. I mean, one of the things about doing a season is you're in charge of 50 cells on a bus. And if, like it happened to me, you got a fire happening on that bus, you as the 20-year-old are responsible for some 50-year-olds and telling them what to do and where they should be going. And especially at times when there's no telecommunications, you do grow up quite quickly and you take on responsibility quite easily.
Amin saw how quickly you could progress through the ranks, going from being a ski guide in Val Thorens to a resort manager with 50 guests per week before the season had even started, by February upping that to 250 guests per week.
And then I got a call saying, actually, you speak Italian. I said, oh, yes, I did mention that in my interview. Can you go to San Vigilio? Literally within a week before the guests arrived, they sent me across to the Dolomites in a place called San Vigilio. It was a resort that had never had tourism before. They'd never had a British company. They'd never seen a rep. And they just said, can you go and set the resort up? And I literally walked into the ski shop and I said, hello, I'm from Bladon Lines. They were like, going, no, we don't want to buy anything. I said, no, I'm not selling anything. I'm not a salesman. I will have clients. I will have 50 clients. Can I have your rates? And they just didn't know what it was. Walked into a bar saying, can I sit here every night, do an office hour? And they said, no, you can't. And I said, look, if I sit here, the clients will come and see me. They'll spend money at the bar. And I'm not expecting free drinks. I just need somewhere to be available. No. And then, of course, within a few weeks, they saw 50 clients arriving on a weekly basis. So, yeah, I kind of felt I was part of the history in that resort, where it was the first company which brought some tourism. And mid-season, early February, they called me saying, we've just sacked our rep in Courmayeur. Would you like to go to Courmayeur? I said, well, look, 6 months ago, the interview, that's where I wanted to go. Of course. Eventually got to Courmayeur that evening and took over a very large resort in terms of Bladon Lines, because we had approximately 250 guests a week. And suddenly there was cars, there was vans, lots of chalet girls and, the MBO, the maintenance guy, the SAS officer. Suddenly I was in charge of all these people. I'd never really led a group.
It was a golden age, a magical time when the Alps were still the Wild West for tour ops and their staff. That season changed my life. Bladon Lines was a great company, and I'll be forever grateful. Andrew, former Bladon Lines rep.
Skiing is an activity you share with friends. Perhaps that's why Bladon Lines still inspires such strong feelings among both staff and guests. People certainly didn't do the job for the money, as Amin Momin confirms.
Listen, I was paid about, I think, £30 a week. But, none of us did it for the money. We did it for the experience. Yeah. We didn't have any expenses. So actually, I've probably saved more money then than I've ever done in my life.
Simon Hoskins picked out the sense of community that Bladon Lines created.
I don't know. I look upon my time as Bladon Lines. It definitely gave me a sense of belonging somewhere. It was a bit like a family in that respect, which certainly helps when sort of forging a career within the ski business. You just felt like you came from a good grounding.
Ed Mannix feels the same.
It was a real sense of community. And for that reason, we stay in contact to this day. 40 years on.
Gareth Crump sums up the impact that working winter seasons had on people's lives in the golden age of the ski chalet holiday.
Many people just do one ski season, and it has quite a formative effect on them. They therefore marry people to ski seasons. Their group of friends for life from the ski seasons and all the rest of it. It has a huge effect on people, and that was thousands of people each year going out to do their one and only season.
I consider some of my best friends to still be from those fun seasons, working, laughing and skiing together. Louise, former Bladon Lines chalet girl.
Gareth mentions that thousands of Brits work ski seasons each winter. Most people listening to this podcast will know that times have changed. When I was running Natives and the Naughties, there was still a huge community of Brits working every winter in the Alps. That business would never have worked if there hadn't been. But sadly, a combination of the Brexit vote in 2016, which meant that Brits lost their automatic right to work in the Alps, and the COVID pandemic in 2020, which put some companies out of business and made operations more complicated for those that remained, changed the landscape completely. In 2020, Crystal Ski, the brash young upstart we heard about earlier, but now Britain's biggest ski company, announced it was cancelling its entire chalet programme. The lobby group, Seasonal Businesses in Travel, reported last year that there has been a 50% reduction in chalet capacity this decade. And to me, a veteran of 6 winter seasons myself, 2 of which were with Bladon Lines, that is such a shame. We've seen how by working for companies like Bladon Lines, people developed not just life skills, but friendships for life. So why did Bladon Lines rise and then fall so rapidly? Hopefully this podcast has helped to tell this story. But let's go back to John Yates Smith for an insight into the founder's approach back in the day and why it became a success.
I consider that I'm running my own holidays, and if people want to pay a bit to come along and join us, they're very welcome. I think that could sum up Mark's attitude, really.
Ultimately, John believes that Bladon Lines was run to be a bit of fun.
It was a little family company, and it was run to be a bit of fun. It wasn't really run to be a serious player.
Simon Bladon still has some wonderful memories of those great days.
For a number of years, we used to organise chalet girl races. At the end of the season, we would organise these chalet girl races, and we would get the chalet girls from every resort. Coaches laid on, they might have to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning or whatever. We normally had them at La Tuile. Even the chalet girls from Southampton, they would have to come, all having to wear their parrot jackets, and you'd have 200 chalet girls, all wearing these bright jackets. Oh, it was a wonderful sight.
I'm sure we can all imagine those hundreds of chalet girls on the mountain, and as Simon says, I'm sure it was a wonderful sight. I'm going to leave the final words to Amin Momen.
Bringing people together is something that probably what I learned from them. Find something that people are interested in, and you create something for them, and you bring like-minded people together, and it's exactly what those guys did.
And that is the story of the rise and fall of Bladon Lines. This episode was written, narrated and edited by me, Ian Martin. I'd like to thank Andy Wadsworth, a chalet girl herself back in the day, for reading the additional clippings, quotes and excerpts, and to everybody who contributed to this episode, including Simon Bladon, John Yates-Smith, Amin Momen, Ed Mannix, Gareth Crump, Nick Morgan and Simon Hoskins. If you enjoyed this episode, or you know someone who worked or took holidays with Bladon Lines back in the 80s or 90s, or simply likes a good ski industry story, then I would appreciate it if you shared this episode with them. And if you want to share your own memories of Bladon Lines, or just let me know what you thought about this episode, then please contact me via Facebook or Instagram at The Ski Podcast, or by email theskipodcast@gmail.com. If you've never listened to the Ski Podcast before, there are over 260 episodes to catch up on. I guarantee you that if you enjoyed this episode, you'll find plenty more to entertain you. Just go to theskipodcast.com, search around the tags and categories, and you're bound to find something you like. Finally, listener, thank you for joining us, wherever in the world you're listening right now. And until next time, goodbye.